Tears flow like rain as the casket of 44-year-old Alino Faso returns home. His mother's cry pierces the air, echoing across the Burkinabe plains. Once a proud voice for unity and freedom, Alino had been seized in the Ivory Coast, accused of spying, silenced in a foreign cell, and returned in a box. What began with one man's death shattered the illusion of peace. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not send condolences. He sent 3,000 soldiers. The ground trembled as armored trucks rumbled south, dust rising like smoke before a storm. To the outside world, it looked like preparation for war. But inside Burkina Faso, it felt like justice marching home. Traoré, seen by his people not as a president, but as the embodiment of defiance, had drawn a red line. For too long, Africa's sons had been humiliated, imprisoned, erased. Not this time. Alino's body, scarred and lifeless, spoke louder than any speech. Ivorian officials called it suicide. Burkinabe voices called it murder. And as thousands filled Ouagadougou's streets waving red and green flags, their chant rose like thunder. You silenced a voice, not the people. The question now burns across Africa's horizon. How many times can you kill a voice before a continent roars back? That was the day Burkina Faso stopped negotiating and started remembering who it was. To Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Alino Faso's death wasn't a diplomatic dispute. It was an assault on sovereignty. The government's statement was not a plea, but an accusation. The circumstances of his death defy human dignity and international law. When Traoré spoke next, his voice was steel. They can kill the body of a Burkinabe, but never the soul of our independence. Those were not words. They were marching orders. By early October 2025, satellite images revealed convoys massing near Banfora, Sinindo and Niangaloko, strategic gateways to the Ivorian north. Officially defensive, but symbolically defiant, the move declared to Abidjan and beyond, Burkina Faso will not be humiliated twice. Western headlines called it reckless. African streets called it awakening. For the first time in years, a government had answered the death of one of its own, not with silence, but with action. To Ouagadougou, Ivory Coast was no longer a neighbor. It was a symbol of the system Traoré swore to dismantle, the one that shields the powerful and silences the bold. And behind every armored truck rolling south was not just an army, but the story of Alino Faso, a man whose voice refused to die. The government may have labeled him an activist, but to the youth of Burkina Faso, Alino Faso was a prophet of pride. Born in the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso, he rose from obscurity to the glow of a smartphone screen, turning frustration into fire. His words were raw, his tone unpolished, yet his message pierced hearts. Justice, dignity, and an Africa that stands without begging. He spoke like the people, sometimes poetic, sometimes profane, always real. So when news broke that Alino had been arrested in Ivory Coast, accused of espionage and conspiracy, no one believed it was justice. It was erasure. For 6 long months, silence. Then, in July 2025, came the statement. He died by suicide. No photos, no witnesses, just another tidy death in a dirty story. But this time, silence screamed louder than the lie. Burkina Faso erupted, streets flooded with red and green flags, mothers weeping, youth chanting his name. He died for truth, he died for Africa. His coffin, draped in the national flag, moved through a sea of mourners, motorbikes roaring, soldiers saluting, hearts burning. The Ivorian version of events felt like a slap. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about dignity and a voice too powerful to kill quietly. Alino Faso's coffin became more than a symbol. It became a banner of defiance. It represented every African silenced for speaking truth. And for Abidjan, it carried a dangerous possibility that his death could unite a divided nation behind one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré's silence was deliberate. He didn't need to speak. The streets spoke for him. We are Alino, they chanted, not for vengeance, but for respect. Yet beneath the grief, suspicion began to take root. The timing felt too precise, the explanations too thin. Was Alino's death just tragedy or an operation? Whispers turned into warnings. To many, this wasn't a crime against one man, it was an attack on a revolution. And once the people started asking why, the government began asking who. Then the tanks began to move. By October 2025, Operation Southern Shield was underway. Over 3,000 troops redeployed south toward the Ivorian border, not for war, but to draw a line of sovereignty no one would cross again. What the world saw as provocation, Burkina Faso saw as rebirth. For years, the nation had been treated as fragile, a pawn in foreign games. But Traoré's doctrine was clear. African sovereignty means never asking permission to defend your own. The mission was simple: to show strength where weakness was expected. But for the soldiers on the ground, this wasn't just about borders. It was about memory. Many had grown up listening to Alino Faso's fiery broadcasts. He told them they were not pawns of foreign interests, but guardians of Africa's dignity. Now his words had become their orders. Officially, the mobilization was labeled a preventive countermeasure. In truth, it was an awakening. Across the border, Abidjan called the move unjustified, urging calm. Yet beneath their diplomacy was panic. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation once dismissed as fragile, had just challenged a coastal powerhouse. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood what others didn't. In the Sahel, perception is power. His message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso will not be bullied, lectured, or controlled. Western powers condemned the build-up, warning of instability, but their outrage only fueled national pride. Across the country, morale surged. Youth volunteered for defense brigades. Posters read, "The South is not for sale. The North has woken." By the time journalists reached the southern frontier, it was clear. Alino's death had birthed a doctrine. His silence had become a strategy, and Traoré's defiance had redrawn Africa's map of power. What began as a standoff of soldiers is now unearthing a buried history, one written not in bullets, but in opposing dreams for Africa. To understand why Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast now stand on opposite sides of a continental divide, we must return to the 1980s, when two visions for Africa were born. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso embodied revolution, rejecting foreign debt, defying colonial influence, and warning, "He who feeds you controls you." Across the border, Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast preached diplomacy, believing survival meant staying close to Paris. One wanted freedom through sacrifice, the other stability through allegiance. When Sankara was assassinated in 1987, the line between those two Africas hardened: sovereignty versus submission, revolution versus restraint. Decades later, Ibrahim Traoré's movement revived Sankara's flame, while Alassane Ouattara's Ivory Coast inherited Houphouët's loyalty to the West. So when Alino Faso died in Ivorian custody, it struck a historic nerve. To Ouagadougou, it wasn't just murder, it was betrayal. Meanwhile, Abidjan calls Burkina's suspicions paranoia, accusing the Sahel alliance of rogue militarism. Yet, for Traoré's supporters, Ivory Coast has become more than a neighbour. It's a proxy of old power. Thus, the troop deployment of 2025 wasn't rash. It was the eruption of decades of polite hostility finally laid bare. Every meeting and handshake between Burkinabe and Ivorian officials now feels rewritten. Less diplomacy, more disguised confrontation. The region can no longer pretend neutrality. Mali and Niger stand openly with Traoré, calling it a defense of Pan-African dignity. In Bamako, state media hails Burkina's defiance. Meanwhile, Abidjan's ECOWAS allies preach restraint, concern that sounds more like pressure. This divide is no longer political, it's civilizational. One Africa seeks independence, even at the cost of blood. The other clings to validation from its former masters, mistaking obedience for peace. Yet peace built on dependency is only war delayed. As trenches deepen and radios jam across the border, the truth grows clear. This isn't about Alino Faso anymore. It's about which Africa will survive. The fear across West Africa isn't whether Burkina will cross the border, but whether the continent must now choose sides: submission or sovereignty, fear or freedom. What began as national defense has become a continental awakening. The AES alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, is transforming from defense pact to doctrine, rewriting Africa's rules of power. The old order is crumbling. For the first time in generations, Africa's uprising wasn't sparked by generals or coups, but by the death of a civilian voice. Alino Faso's story has become the moral spine of a continent in transformation, a reminder that revolutions don't always begin with guns, but with injustice too great to ignore. His death left a void that Ibrahim Traoré filled, not with vengeance, but conviction. It's as if the soul of a fallen patriot became the compass of a rising Africa. But this awakening carries danger. Moral revolutions attract opportunists, and West Africa knows manipulation well. If Burkina Faso's defiance is misread as aggression, it could invite peacekeeping interventions, the old script of sanctions, embargoes and coups. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the momentum is unstoppable. The youth are no longer spectators. They farm instead of waiting for aid, defend their land instead of depending on foreign troops. Self-sufficiency has become resistance, and that's what terrifies the old powers most. Once a generation learns to live without dependency, control loses its grip. In this light, Ivory Coast is more than a rival. It's the last fortress of the old order. If Traoré holds the line without war, it will mark a turning point. Proof that African strength can rise from unity, not approval. Alino Faso's dream lives on, an Africa that refuses to bow and finally begins to believe in itself.